Hello and welcome once again to Baked Beans Garage, where get down from there before you hurt yourself. Today we're going to be working on how the boost gets into the engine. Of course it's staying mostly stock under here, but I do want to add an intercooler just for managing the EGTs and whatnot, so let's get into it. So a while ago you saw me rebuild that and put it back in there, but I haven't talked much yet about the turbo setup, so let me do that now. I'm going to be sticking with the original turbo. I did find a new core for it, so that'll get rebuilt. But I do want to do something besides plugging the turbo compressor outlet straight into the intake manifold, because that tends to get quite hot and you're going to warp ahead if you hammer on it too much. So I have this, just a no-name eBay intercooler, also no-name eBay intercooler front mount kit, and the manifold. Now the biggest problem with these manifolds is that right here we have cast into it where the turbo outlet plugs straight into. Now these did come with an intercooler overseas, and they had a duct, I guess, that came across so the intercooler could come up from the side to plug in, but we never got those in the States, and those manifolds are quite expensive. Alternatively, the NA engines that came in 240s, they have a much bigger inlet right here, and guys like to use those for flow. And another problem, a lot of those intakes got cut up because obviously being a Volkswagen diesel, we have that pattern. There's a rabbit intake I was practicing welding on. You could see that is the same as that, so guys like to cut these up to make big intakes for TDI engines, so they're just not, you know, easy to find anymore. So here I have just a cast aluminum 2.5 inch elbow, what you'd, you know, stick on an intercooler if you were doing mods. So I'm just going to stick that, on there. Now usually I like to explain things when I'm doing them, but I'm not going to bother when I'm TIG welding, because I literally first picked up a TIG torch like a day ago. So this is going to be ugly, but, you know, welder and paint. Wait, grinder and paint, welder I ain't, something like that. So I'm going to stick that on there, but I'm going to practice on this one first, because I happen to need one as well. As for hogging the hole out, what for making that fit, I think my best bet's just going to be ye old hole saw. Now of course there is no material here what for registering, so I cut this out with a smaller bit, and I'm just going to hot glue that in there so I have a center register. We'll see if it works. So here's where I landed. This 80s cast aluminum is so bad. There are so many impurities blowing out of it constantly that it got ugly. But being a novice TIG welder, you know, I'm happy enough. I am confident that this will hold up for me, but for the project I am getting paid for, I don't think I'm gonna delete that like I did here. Just gonna, you know, blow the hole in there and put the nipple on. And for that patch, I used only the highest quality aerospace grade scrap that I found in the pot. Don't worry about that. So I think now we can test fit it on my car, and then we'll work on his car. So that doesn't work quite yet. We'll figure that out later. So the finished manifold, I ended up sanding it to like 400 grit, then I clear coated it with some engine enamel just to keep it looking pretty for longer. For here, I'm going to get one of those universal freeze plugs, what expands when you shove it in. That's about 50 millimeters, so one is available. On to this, the entire turbo thingy, I do have a new cartridge. So rebuilding these is actually quite simple. It's just some seals and some bearings. Oil runs through there to cool it and lubricate it. But the issue is these things spin so fast, balance is pretty critical, and people at home don't really have the machinery to do that. So I just got a whole new cartridge. This one was from eBay. I'm pretty surprised I could find it because it's like for this specific engine setup. It has a really weird trim turbine wheel. Not going to talk about that. That's a little advanced, but anyways, this is a certified Shenzhen spoolie boy, so that'll be going in. As for this guy, as you can see, we still have the EGR, exhaust gas recirculation. If you're not familiar with that, that's just an emissions device. Now, I don't condone breaking the laws wherever you live, but where I live in my country, it is legal to get rid of this, and it'll gain you some simplicity and a little bit of power. Now, the HX35 that came off this rig just so happened to have a block-off plate for that. It's a little uglier than I would like, and it clearly was leaking, so I think I'm going to trim that up to the gasket that's conveniently stuck on there, and then just put it on the other way and hope it doesn't leak, but we'll see. Speaking of the HX35, I only just noticed that it doesn't have a wastegate actuator, and whoever put this on actually chopped up some of the wastegate linkage to weld the wastegate shut. And I can appreciate that not everyone watching this might know what a wastegate is, and everyone that is watching this also might think that that is an intercooler. It's not. So to the whiteboard. So I understand that the audience of this video is going to have a very wide array of understandings of, you know, how all these bits work. So I'm going to try to keep it as concise and maybe entertaining as I possibly can for everyone. So all an engine does, it takes in air, it adds fuel, it makes it blow up, it makes that air hot, and in turn expanding it, and then it shoves it out, also shoving that piston down. And all a turbocharger does is it takes that hot expanding air, makes it spin a wheel using that energy, which drives another wheel, which takes the incoming air, squeezes it, and then sends it back into the engine. And as you may or might not know, squeezing the air makes it denser. That means more fuel can be burned from that air, and more power, baby. And because thermodynamics, when you take that intake air, squeeze it to make it more dense, it's going to get a lot hotter. So an intercooler, that's just a heat exchanger with, you know, ambient air. Ambient air is going to be a lot cooler than that compressed air, so that just cools it down a little bit before it shoves it back into the engine. That slows the air down a little bit and makes it even more denser because it throws some of that energy off into ambient air. And there's your throttle body, or your carburetor, if you're enough of a nerd to have one of those. Of course, we don't in the diesel, mercifully. And now what can happen when you have a turbo that is properly sized for your engine, if you're really pushing a bunch of power at a bunch of RPMs, you can be shoving out too much hot air, spinning that turbine wheel way too fast and creating too much pressure in this, which could either cause your gasoline engine to lean out or cause your diesel engine to just make too much power and you blow up the bottom end. And we don't want that. So the wastegate, it takes some of this air that the turbine is using to spin that compressor wheel and just shoves it past the turbine wheel into the exhaust, thus making less pressure here, thus making less pressure here, so you don't blow it up. Now, that's labeled aftercooler, you may notice. So the term intercooler, that was coined in World War II when we were making some pretty monstrous engines. Let me draw a picture of that and explain why that's an aftercooler, not an intercooler. So in the early days of aviation, when we needed some pretty hefty airplanes, you know, for violence, we came up with some pretty inventive forced induction systems, because of course you go up higher in altitude, the air gets thinner, you need more forced induction to compensate for that. So here we have a multiple stage forced induction system. I was too lazy to change my drawing all that much, so for illustration purposes I have a turbocharger feeding a centrifugal supercharger, but you know, those could be swapped. All these terms will be the same. So of course we have the ambient intake air coming into the turbo. It gets squeezed and heated up, comes down here to the intercooler, Cools down a little bit, then is shoved back out into the inlet of the supercharger, and then it gets squeezed again, heated up more, and then it goes through the aftercooler. So an aftercooler happens at the last stage of forced induction. The intercooler is meant to be between stages of forced induction. I don't know why intercooler became the vernacular for aftercoolers. Of course, a lot of these systems are outdated anymore with, you know, electronic turbo control and everything. Look up VNT turbos. That's pretty cool. Anyways, I have made myself feel better by thinking I have explained this to you. Don't bother telling me if I didn't. Just Google it. So with the rambling out of the way, it's time to crack into this guy. Just got to pull the compressor housing off, then pull out the nugget. Might just leave the turbine housing on the manifold because it doesn't look like it was leaking at all. Can't get that line out of the oil filter pedestal, so I'm going to have to take it off of there and maybe try to free it up on the bench. Anyways, just going to take all the bolts out. So I have not been having a good time. Getting this turbine housing retainer ring onto the new turbo nugget was quite the pain. I had to do some precision mutilation. On later T3s, I see that it's split on either side. That was after I started cutting, but it's on there. Should work. Also, for once in my life, I've had some foresight, and I marked the clocking where this nugget needs to sit in there, you know, what like that. But when I was washing it, it kind of came off. So I'm going to stab the manifold back into the car so I can eyeball my cartridge clocking as well as the compressor housing clocking, because it's not going to go up into the manifold. It's going to go down under the frame rail now. I also cleaned up the EGR blanking plate, made it a little more tidy. So to the car. So I got the breathing equipment temporarily installed in there, and out there looking at the parts car, I realized this is going to be a much bigger headache than I originally hoped, predictably. So I'm going to go ahead and put in all the stuff what's missing here, just so I can make the tubes not hit anything. So here I have all that stuff. Got the fan, new Nissan's rad. This is the AC compressor that came off of that engine, given the shape of the rest of the engine. I'm going to take my chances on it. We'll see. It seems to go when I turn it over and it moves some air. Not to say it's going to move refrigerant, but we'll see. Prettied up the power steering pump. That is the one system that worked when I first got this car. Got the bracket, new fan clutch, prettied up the pulleys. More bracketry, so just a little time lapse. I'm going to put all those bolts in. And with the face loosely put together, it's time to start guesstimating where I'm going to put all the pipes. First things first, the intercooler, so I know where the pipes need to go. That's where I'm going to stick it. It's going to get some nice air wet through those scoops in the bottom. Only problem is there's not really much here to tie it into, so I think I'm going to run a tube or a angle iron or something across the frame rails and then tie that into both upper and lower bosses on the intercooler, so to the scrap pile. And here's where I landed. I found this piece of angle iron that definitely was never part of a bed frame. I think I'm going to have to trim the inside edge of that scoop there. I threw the condenser in, and it's going to interfere there a little bit, but it looks like the line will clear, so I have to scooch that forward a little bit. I'm going to put 2 tabs right here to mount the top. I am probably going to weld this straight to the frame rails. Obviously, all of this comes out for getting the engine in and out, but that's only another probably 2 inches up from the original cross member, so I'm not worried about it. Fabricobble in time. So here's where I landed for the pipes. There was a little too many obstacles up in this corner, so I took it down across the bottom and up here. So now all that's left to do, I got to burn that bracket in, then put beads on all the pipes. And then the exhaust and intake have to come back off. Got to button up the turbo and actually permanently install that. So here's the very nearly correct way. I'm going to put the beads on the pipes. This is just a pair of diagonal cutters from the Harbor Freight that I lopped the cutting edges off. It does a decent job. You're not going to see that. It doesn't matter. It'll hold the boot on. So that is just the crimper part there left, and I'm sure you can imagine what to do. And then just continue that till all the tendons in your forearm melt. So for putting the nugget back in the gerbo, the turbine housing just uses a metal on metal seal, so you want to torquing those down in a star pattern, like you're tightening a wheel, because that will let you cock it sideways and that'll crash the turbine wheel into the housing, and you want to avoid that. So just go incrementally, give her a spin every few turns, make sure you're not doing any damage. And then the compressor housing uses an O-ring right there. But before I can put this back together, I gotta weld a bead onto the end here, because from the factory that kind of jams into the EGR pipe thingy, and then that bolts into the manifold, so that's rigid. But since the this is going to be a silicone coupler, I need a bead on there, and this is just a reducer. I think it's 1.5 to 2.5, 2 1/4. I don't know. It makes this plug into the rest of the pipes. So a few notes on the intake before I slap it on there. Don't forget this crossover pipe. I forget if NA's had the oil cooler, but that's what this feeds. It plugs into a little coupler back here. I already got that put on, and kind of just squeezes between the head and the intake on these two little bushings here. Close enough. Also, in a previous episode I mentioned that I'd be getting two 1.6D intake manifold gaskets instead of trying to find one for a D24. These are just cheaper and easier to get here in North America. So for cylinders 2, 3, 4, and 5, that guy fits on as is, but for numbers 1 and 6, I'm just going to lop number 1 and 4 off and use some gasket shellac to stick them on there, and then bolt the thing on. And with that all nailed down, I'm pretty happy with how this has come out. I did have to reconfigure the wastegate actuator lines going up and over, because they were going to interfere with the intercooler hoses, or oil cooler hoses. Yeah, this is kind of clunky, but it'll work, I hope. I don't know. That's probably a good actuator. I'm just going to stick a boost gauge on it to make sure it's not over boosting, and maybe I'll have to go back and put a dump valve in. I did also realize that this is going to interfere with the factory intake, but I haven't been able to find a factory airbox yet anyway, so that'll happen later when I deal with the PCV system. Speaking of clearances, I'm pretty sure the AC lines are going to clear that intercooler pipe. If it doesn't, we'll just figure it out later. Also, this isn't the bumper I'm going to end up using in the end. I'm going to use one off the parts car, but I am going to put some mesh in the intake there for keeping the rocks out of it. But happy with that mounting. It's not hanging out the bottom like a VL Commodore. Oh yeah, I do look at my analytics. I know there's probably not a lot of Aussies here, but pretty happy with that. So now I'm just gonna mock everything back up to make sure it still fits, I guess, and I think that'll be it. Now that's very nearly a complete engine bay. So most of what's left to do is the cooling system, which will be next episode, but after that we'll be almost ready for a first start. That'll be exciting, but we'll get to it. Speaking of next episode, just got some few bits here, new fan, jug, external transmission cooler. We'll get to that. That's also not the condenser I'm going to be using. Got to start taking apart the parts car. So I'm pretty happy with how the work in this episode turned out. Got a lot more slick than it could have gone. And I did learn something. We're not going to talk about my TIG skills, especially on that compressor outlet, but it looks good from here. Anyways, think that's it for today. So as always, I do appreciate you watching and supporting the channel. I hope you found it entertaining or informative or something like that. I do ask that you comment, subscribe, leave a like. That all helps. Either way, I am Chinchilla, and I'll see you next time.